Emily clutched her worn-out teddy bear, her small fingers digging into the fabric. She stood on the witness stand, her legs trembling beneath her, but her voice, steady and clear, cut through the tense silence like a knife. "My mom, she's not who you think she is." The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Some whispered in shock. Others exchanged uneasy glances. At the defense table, Margaret Reynolds didn't flinch. Her cold green eyes locked onto Emily, her expression unreadable, but her fingers curled into tight fists. It was a silent warning. The judge's gavel slammed down, order in the court. But there was no stopping it now. Emily had spoken, and what she was about to reveal would shatter the illusion of a perfect mother forever. What would you do if you discovered a shocking truth about someone you trusted? Would you have the courage to speak up like Emily did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Love gripping stories? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss one. The town of Maplewood was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, where children rode their bikes down tree-lined streets, and where everyone believed that Margaret Maggie Reynolds was the perfect mother. She was active in the community, always the first to volunteer for charity events, and never missed a Sunday at church. Her home was immaculate, her manners polished, and her smile radiant. And then there was Emily Carter, a bright-eyed, soft-spoken 10-year-old with golden curls and a voice that could melt even the hardest of hearts. She loved to sing, always humming a tune under her breath. To the outside world, she was a happy, well-loved child. But those who looked closer, really looked, might have noticed the way her shoulders tensed when her mother called her name. They might have seen how she rarely spoke unless spoken to, how she always seemed just a little too eager to please, obey, and never, ever make a mistake. Because behind the closed doors of their pristine home, Emily lived in fear. She had learned, from an early age, that mistakes came with consequences. A spilled glass of milk could mean going to bed hungry. A forgotten chore might earn hours of silence, cold and suffocating. A wrong word, a wrong look, and she could feel the sting of her mother's hand. Maggie's voice was always calm, always measured, even when she punished her. "This is for your own good, Emily. If I don't teach you, who will?" And so Emily learned. She learned to stay quiet, to be good, to be perfect. But one ordinary afternoon, perfection shattered. While cleaning her mother's office, a task she had done 100 times before, Emily stumbled upon a small, worn-out folder tucked away in a locked drawer. Her hands trembled as she pried it open. Inside, among tax forms and charity receipts, was a birth certificate. Her birth certificate. And right there, under Mother's name, it didn't say Margaret Reynolds. It said Claire Dawson. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The room around her seemed to spin. If Maggie wasn't her real mother, then who was she? And what else had been a lie? In that moment, she knew nothing in her life would ever be the same. The porcelain cup slipped from Emily's small hands, crashing onto the kitchen floor. The sharp sound shattered the silence like a gunshot. For a second, she could only stare at the broken shards, her breath caught in her throat, her fingers frozen in midair. Then, footsteps. Slow, measured, unforgiving. Margaret Reynolds appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. Her silence was far more terrifying. Emily scrambled to pick up the pieces, her fingers shaking. If she could just clean it up fast enough, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. I'm sorry, she whispered, voice barely audible. Maggie crouched down beside her, picking up a single shard. She turned it between her fingers, studying it with unsettling calmness. Then she lifted her gaze, her green eyes locking onto Emily's. Cold, detached. "Do you know what happens to careless little girls?" Emily swallowed hard, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Maggie reached forward, gripping her wrist in a firm, almost gentle hold. Then, without another word, she yanked her to her feet and dragged her through the house. Past the grand fireplace, past the framed family photos where they looked so perfect, so happy. The front door swung open. A gust of cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and the distant rumble of thunder. Emily's breath hitched. "Please, I'm sorry. I'll clean it up, I swear." Maggie didn't listen. She never did. She shoved Emily out onto the porch. The rain hit her like ice. The thin nightgown clung to her body, her bare feet numb against the wooden planks. Her teeth chattered, her fingers curled into fists as she wrapped her arms around herself. "Stay here," Maggie said simply, "and think about what you've done." The door slammed shut. Emily gasped. She lunged forward, banging on the wooden frame. "Mom, please, I'm cold. I won't do it again. I swear, I'll be good." No answer. She stood there, drenched and shivering, rain streaming down her face like silent tears. Her entire body trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Something breaking inside her. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. She didn't know. All she knew was this: she couldn't live like this anymore. She had spent her whole life trying to be perfect, trying to obey, trying to make Maggie love her. But no matter how much she tried, it was never enough. And as the icy rain seeped into her bones, so did a horrifying realization: Maggie would never change. No matter how much Emily begged, no matter how much she tried, she would never be safe here. A sharp clap of thunder roared overhead. Emily flinched, curling tighter into herself. And in that moment, the last sliver of hope inside her, the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could make Maggie love her, finally died. The next morning, Emily moved carefully through the house, her limbs stiff from the cold. Maggie sat at the dining table, sipping tea as if nothing had happened. No mention of last night, no glance in Emily's direction. She had expected it. That was always the worst part. The punishments were never about anger, never about losing control. They were calculated, precise, cold. Emily ate in silence, barely tasting the food, but something inside her felt different. For the first time in her life, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt angry. That was when she saw it. The office door, usually locked, was slightly ajar. Her heart pounded. Maggie never left it open. Emily hesitated. She knew she shouldn't. If Maggie caught her, but then she remembered the rain. The locked door. She stepped inside. The office smelled like paper and ink, a room filled with carefully organized secrets. Emily ran her fingers across the desk, her breath hitching when she saw a small metal box tucked inside the bottom drawer. The latch was loose. She flipped it open. Inside, folders, documents. Her hands shook as she sifted through them. Rows of numbers, handwritten signatures, charity reports, financial records. Her fingers brushed against something thinner, a single yellowed sheet of paper buried beneath the stack. She pulled it out, her birth certificate. She stared at it, confused at first, until her eyes landed on the words that would change everything. Mother's name, Claire Dawson. Her breath caught, the room spun. This was wrong. This had to be wrong. She blinked, reading it again. Again. But the name never changed. Margaret Reynolds was not her mother. A strangled breath left her lips. Her hands clenched the paper so tightly that it crumpled, her chest rising and falling in sharp, panicked gasps. If Maggie wasn't her real mother, then who was she? What else had been a lie? The air felt too thick, the walls too close. She couldn't breathe. Emily stumbled back from the desk, her entire world cracking apart at the seams. She had always believed she was the problem. But now she knew the truth. She wasn't broken. She wasn't a bad daughter. She was something else entirely. A stolen child. And now that she knew the truth, there was no going back. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that made the air feel heavy, pressing down on Emily's small frame as she sat, waiting. Across the room, Margaret Reynolds sat at the defendant's table, poised and composed. She wore a muted gray dress, her hair neatly pinned back. To anyone who didn't know the truth, she looked like a dignified mother fighting for her reputation. Her attorney stood beside her, smooth and confident as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a tragic misunderstanding. My client, a woman who has devoted her life to charity and motherhood, is being unfairly accused. These allegations, embezzlement, fraud, preposterous. And as for these other, more personal accusations, let's remember we are talking about a frightened little girl, a child who may not fully understand the weight of her words." He turned, glancing toward Emily. She shrank back in her chair. The courtroom murmured. She could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, some skeptical, some pitying. And then she felt Maggie's eyes. Even from across the room, the message was clear. Stay silent. The same warning she had lived under for 10 years. Emily's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. No more. A deep voice rang out. Call to the stand, Emily Carter. The floor felt unsteady beneath her feet as she rose. Each step toward the witness stand felt heavier than the last. She climbed onto the chair, her small frame swallowed by the towering podium. A bailiff stepped forward, holding out a worn Bible. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Emily hesitated. The truth. She had kept silent for so long, lied to protect Maggie, lied to herself. But then she remembered the bruises, the nights of hunger, the cold rain soaking through her nightgown as Maggie locked her outside. She looked up, past Maggie, past the jury, and saw Claire Dawson, her mother, the woman she had never known. Tears glistened in Claire's eyes. Her hands were clasped together as if holding on to hope, as if silently telling Emily, I'm here. For the first time, Emily felt something other than fear. She felt strength. She lifted her chin. I do, she whispered. The prosecutor approached. His voice was kind but firm. Emily, can you tell the court what it was like living with Margaret Reynolds? Her breath hitched. She could still feel Maggie's stare burning into her. Memories flashed, the slaps, the insults, the hunger. The night Maggie had left her in the rain. Emily's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. The attorney for the defense rose quickly. Your Honor, this is a child. Clearly she's overwhelmed. Perhaps we should... No, Emily had been silent for too long. She turned back to the judge. Her voice was quiet, but steady. She's lying. The room went still. Maggie's fingers twitched on the table. Emily took a deep breath, then said the words that would change everything. Maggie Reynolds is not my mother. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor stepped forward. Emily, can you clarify what you mean by that? Emily's throat tightened. She thought she might choke on the words. But then she remembered who she was really speaking to. Not the judge, not the jury. Maggie. She met her mother's eyes, cold, furious, but no longer in control. And then Emily shattered the illusion. She kidnapped me. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs, the sharp shuffle of reporters scribbling notes. The judge banged his gavel. Order, order in the court. Maggie shot to her feet. That's not true. Her voice was sharp, laced with something Emily had never heard before. Panic. Her lawyer looked at her in shock. He hadn't expected this. The prosecutor raised a hand. Your Honor, we have evidence to support Emily's claim. Emily's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the birth certificate. The judge took it. The entire courtroom held its breath as he scanned the document. Then his eyes lifted to Maggie. Silence. And for the first time, Margaret Reynolds had no words. She stood frozen, her perfectly composed mask crumbling. She opened her mouth to argue, to lie, to twist the truth just one more time. But it was over. There was nothing left to say. Maggie slumped back into her chair. Her hands, which had always been so steady, now trembled as she clenched the fabric of her dress. Emily exhaled. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She had spoken, and the world had finally listened. The courtroom was deathly silent. The judge's fingers traced the edges of the birth certificate, his gaze scanning the document with deliberate precision. A moment passed, then another. Finally, he lifted his eyes and looked directly at Maggie. Maggie Reynolds, he said, his voice calm but weighted. This document clearly states that the child known as Emily Carter was born to Claire Dawson. It directly contradicts the legal adoption records you provided. How do you explain this? All eyes turned to Maggie. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her hands were clasped tightly on the table, her knuckles white. Emily held her breath. This was it. This was the moment Maggie would finally lose control. Then, it happened. Maggie stood abruptly, the scrape of her chair against the floor slicing through the air like a knife. Her face twisted, the cold mask she had worn for so long finally cracking. I raised her, she spat. For 10 years. I gave her a home. I fed her. I clothed her. She is mine. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Emily flinched at the raw fury in her voice. But this time she wasn't afraid. The judge's gavel slammed down. Mrs. Reynolds, sit down immediately. But Maggie wasn't listening. Her wild eyes darted around the courtroom, her mind racing for a way out. A way to explain, to manipulate, to twist the truth as she always had. But there was no way out. Not this time. The prosecutor took a step forward, his voice steady. Your Honor, in addition to the birth certificate, we have obtained records proving that Margaret Reynolds forged legal documents to assume guardianship of Emily Carter under false pretenses. A court clerk stepped forward, placing a thick file onto the judge's desk. The judge flipped through the pages, his face hardening. Each document was another nail in the coffin of Margaret Reynolds' perfect life. Finally, he looked up. His voice was firm, final. Margaret Reynolds, you are hereby placed under arrest for fraud, document forgery, and unlawful custody of a minor. The words struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. Emily exhaled shakily. It was over. The door at the back of the room opened, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Maggie's breath came in short, frantic bursts. Her head snapped toward the officers, then back to the judge. For the first time in 10 years, Margaret Reynolds was powerless. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, you don't understand. The officers approached. She backed away. I'm her mother, Maggie screamed, thrashing as the officers grabbed her arms. She's mine. Do you hear me? She's mine. Emily shut her eyes, her chest tightening. For years, she had been afraid of this woman, afraid of her voice, her words, her punishments. But now, as she listened to Maggie's desperate screams, she just felt sorry for her. The officers led Maggie away. She struggled, but the fight was gone from her now. Her words, once so sharp and cruel, now felt empty. As the doors swung shut behind them, silence settled over the courtroom once more. Emily let out a shaky breath. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The courtroom was empty now. The echoes of the gavel's final strike had faded, and the murmurs of the crowd had long since disappeared into the hallways. But Emily still sat there, frozen in place. She had won. Maggie was gone. She was finally free. So why did she feel so lost? She stared down at her hands, running her fingers over the faded seams of her dress. She should be happy. She should feel relief, joy, something. But instead, all she felt was uncertainty. Across the room, Claire Dawson stood quietly. She had been watching her, not approaching, not pushing, just waiting. Waiting for Emily to decide whether to acknowledge her. Emily lifted her gaze, eyes locking onto Claire's for the first time since the trial ended. She had her eyes. That was the first thing Emily noticed. The same deep shade of brown, the same flicker of hesitation. Her mother. The word felt foreign in her mind. Claire Dawson was her mother. But Emily didn't know her. Didn't know her voice. Didn't know her laugh. Didn't know how she took her coffee in the morning, or if she liked to hum while she folded laundry. Didn't know if her hugs were warm. Maggie had raised her. For 10 years, Maggie had been the only mother she knew. Even if it had been filled with pain, at least it was familiar. This was something entirely new. Emily's fingers curled into her lap. Her voice was small when she finally spoke. I don't know you. Claire's breath caught, but she nodded as if she had expected that. She took a step forward, then slowly knelt so she was at eye level with Emily. Her movements were careful, almost cautious, like someone trying not to scare away a wounded bird. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, gentle. You don't have to, sweetheart. She hesitated, her throat tight, but then she continued. You don't have to believe me. You don't have to trust me. And you don't have to come with me if you're not ready. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her own confusion pressing down on her. But Claire didn't rush her. Didn't demand anything. Instead, she reached out, not to grab her, not to pull her close, just to hold out her hand. A choice. Emily stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out, too. Her small fingers brushed against Claire's, hesitant at first, then curling around them. It wasn't much, but for the first time in her life, bookmark, it was enough. Emily sat in the backseat of the car, watching the world blur past through the window. The courthouse was behind her now. So was Maggie. She exhaled slowly, her fingers still wrapped around the soft, unfamiliar warmth of Claire's hand. It didn't feel like home, not yet, but for the first time, it felt like possibility. Life had taught Emily one thing. Family wasn't always about blood. For 10 years, she had lived under the illusion that love had to be earned. That if she was good enough, quiet enough, obedient enough, maybe one day, she would deserve kindness. But now she knew the truth. Real family didn't make you beg for love. Real family didn't punish you for being imperfect. Real family didn't hold you captive in fear. Sometimes the people who truly love us aren't the ones we are born to, but the ones who choose us. Not everything would be easy. Healing takes time. Trust takes time. But as Emily glanced at Claire, at the woman who had never stopped searching for her, never stopped loving her, even from afar, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. And that was the first step toward being free. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe that family is more than just blood? Your voice matters. If you found meaning in Emily's journey, please like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Every bit of support helps us continue bringing powerful, heartfelt stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that inspires, moves, and reminds us all of the strength and truth and love. Thank you for being here.